It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for organizing this at this sort of late stage. It was kind of last minute. I've been in the country for the last couple of weeks, seeing family. I am partially from Connecticut, but I'm also Palestinian. And I've spent the greater part of the last 25 years overseas in Palestine. With today's talk, it's a small, intimate gathering. I take it that most folks here are long dedicated, have been part of the game, let's say, for the last who knows how long, but certainly at least since October 23. And I intend with my talk today to sort of, use this as an opportunity for us to sort of like have an open discussion. And I will attempt to provide a presentation in terms of how I see the situation, and then we can see how we can sort of attempt to translate that into action and a way to look forward as we go forward from this room, I guess. So I think, as everyone will know in this room, we're approaching 20 months of an ongoing genocide. The statistics from a conservative perspective are horrific and daunting. We're talking about 53,000 people who have been documented to have been killed, but of course the estimates are much higher in terms of missing, as well as people who may have died in indirect ways. 125,000 injured, 2 million people displaced, 18,000 people detained, 175,000 homes destroyed, and this all for a territory that the United Nations declared to be unlivable in 2012, right? And that it was a toxic environment with 98% of its water polluted. In addition to the fact that, of course, the majority of the population of the Gaza Strip are refugees themselves and displaced persons. So we're talking about multiply displaced persons, unable to even exercise an ability to become refugees again, or we're talking about refugees being bombed in their own refugee camp, right? And being denied that. So we're in a Orwellian world of kinds of oppression, let alone to speak of the kinds of technology that have been used to facilitate that. Joseph Borrell, who was the European Union Vice President recently retired, received some sort of fancy European award called the Charles V European Award on just last Friday. And he had the following to say, which I think is quite telling. He said, "We are witnessing," and this is the head of the number 2 in the EU. He said, "We are witnessing the largest ethnic cleansing operation since the end of World War II, for the sole purpose of creating a splendid holiday destination once the millions of tons of Gaza's rubble are cleared and the Palestinians are either gone or dead." I mean, he continues by saying, "We use a double standard when judging crimes against humanity, depending on who commits them." He references the 1941 Holocaust-era Babin Yar's massacre, where 34,000 Jews were murdered by Nazis, saying that their bodies remain buried at the bottom of those ravines, but uses that as a way to bridge and say they had not yet industrialized death. The gas chambers had not yet been invented. They were shot one by one in the back of the neck. And then he adds that eliminating human beings because they belong to an ethnic group is one of the greatest atrocities humanity has committed, and the Jews paid an enormous price for that. But it was not the Palestinians who killed the Jews, and we do not have the right to pass on our responsibility or make them pay to ease our guilt. So, these are statements not from some radical left-wing who knows who, or, this is from the center of power. Now he's not in power, but he's declaring very... What it speaks to, I think, is a form of extreme crisis and even within elites, as to how the Gaza genocide is basically undermining the entire post-World War II and Atlanticist order, and it is one facet of a larger set of this decline and this sort of collapse, so to speak, in this era of history. Of course, at the same time, Israel has also declared that if Trump returns from his Middle East trips without a deal, that Israel is willing and will launch its final solution, and basically saying it that way, where they intend to demolish every standing building in Gaza and launch a large-scale ground operation to finally uproot whatever Hamas is the declared thing. But ultimately what they say and declare that they want to do is they want to create a sanitized zone in the south, in Rafah. Of course, it's not by chance that they pick Rafah, because it's right next to the Egyptian border. After starving the Palestinians in Gaza, which they've been doing for the last 2 months, to put the food there and to force people to come in to get any kind of food, and then use that as a kind of leverage, as a way to, and they're very clear about it, to ship people out. So a very, open, in your face, we're going to do this kind of ethnic cleansing, right? Despite Israel's goals being that we're going to eliminate, and anyone else outside of the sanitized zone, of course, will be killed, okay? So that's the plan. They're saying it up front. The question is, what do we do about it, right? And I can understand and I appreciate that those are big questions and they're demoralizing questions, but at the same time, I also want to argue that they shouldn't be demobilizing. And it is our obligation to sort of use our intellect and our will and our intention to understand the situation, to try and understand the weaknesses of it, to try and understand what we can do as individuals, but as well as communities, and enact forms of collective action to be able to stand up to this historical responsibility and what we're encountering today. So hopefully this discussion will be part of that. But I don't want to pretend that I have all the answers, and I also want to say that the lay of the land is broad. It's not, this discussion is being heard in New Haven, Connecticut today in the beginning of May, but it might look different in California, or it might look different in England, or in other parts of the world where people may be listening to this. So there's no cookie cutter approach to things, but we can generally use, similar tools of analysis. And I will also hopefully provide a little bit of a guide for what I think, how people can take the broad analysis and create more focused context-specific answers later on. So I guess I wanted to start with the first part of my little triad where I said responsibilities, dilemmas, and opportunities. First being, of course, the responsibilities. It was referred to in the beginning by the Hind. And I think it's obvious. I mean, I don't need to say anything more. And you've already taken the time out of your day to come to this and to see. You obviously recognize a kind of responsibility to understand and to see where we can take things. Obviously, the responsibility is particular. It's a human one. It's one as Americans. It's one as taxpayers. It's one as folks who provide for things done in our name as Americans with our tax money. Israel, of course, has been the largest cumulative recipient of American international aid to the tune of $310 billion since its founding. Per annum, it gets around $3.5 to $4 billion. Since the genocide began, we're talking, according to statistics from Brown, it's in the range of $18 or $20 billion. In addition to another $8.8 billion that was put up on the block just last month, I believe. And when Bernie Sanders tried to get it voted upon, only 14 out of 100 senators basically resisted or said no. So what we're talking about when we're talking about responsibility is a bipartisan responsibility, at least from the centers of power and those who supposedly represent Americans. But it's not just a political responsibility, it's also a corporate responsibility, I would argue. And here I'm not just talking about the typical arms dealers of Northrop Grumman and Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, etc. But we're also talking about a new set of actors like in terms of the big high-tech players who have entered into the scene and are very much entangled in this whole new forms of warfare. We're talking about Microsoft and Amazon and Google, who have all provided different forms of high-tech facilitation, the full extent of which we do not know, but we also are probably very keenly aware that these are part and parcel of new forms of big brothers, so to speak, surveillance technologies and what do they call it? The different kinds of cloud technologies that are being used to, and artificial intelligence. And very much so we see high-tech capital looking towards Israel as this sort of research and development hub that they can benefit from. Because in many respects, the occupied territories for many years were, of course, are and have been a captive population. It's pretty obvious. And in fact, the last 30 years, a large part of my book was about basically trying to understand. But for years, there never used to be statistics on the occupied territories. They all used to be subsumed under Israel's statistics of Judea and Samaria. They didn't parse the OPT as separate from Israel because they didn't recognize it. After the first Intifada, they were kind of forced into creating the autonomy areas, the area A's, where the Palestinian Authority would be created, and that created a syntactical sort of differentiation of Palestine, okay, like in a nomenclatural sense. So you created a Palestine telephone line, you created .ps internet, but all of those actually went through Israel, okay, and in fact the whole thing was a big guise, so to speak. And the Gaza genocide actually very much shows that today. In fact, the peace process acted as a kind of, by the end of the peace process, everyone was very clear that that was a kind of apartheid that had developed. And from that apartheid that was created through the peace process, it enabled the genocide to take place. Had Palestinians and Israelis really, the previous dynamics and the entanglement and the singular regime over both Palestinians and Israelis been maintained as it had before the peace, there's no way that the genocide would have been able to happen. There was no borders around Gaza in 1994, right? In fact, it was the peace process that created the borders, right? The first border was in 1994 that they put around Gaza. Then they built another one in 2002. And then they built the super fancy one in 2018 with billions of dollars. And that's the one that Hamas demolished on October the thing. In any case, and Gaza since then, that was all to simply make the point that, Gaza has been this sort of frontier laboratorial space where high-tech sort of regimes of surveillance and control have been exercised, which is of great importance to population management, which Western countries and the United States is also very keen. So that brings up the sort of link with the corporate interests of the U.S. But it's not just a political responsibility, nor is it just a corporate responsibility. It goes to the next level in the United States, at least. I mean, we're talking about, you can buy settlement property on the internet in this country. You can, many of the charities which go to fund settlements and overtly racist, fascistic, Jewish supremacist agendas in the West Bank are organized out of the United States, out of Philadelphia, out of New York, places where there are hard right-wing, Jewish supremacist sort of outfits out there. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I was here for the Ben Gvir thing. Ben Gvir was considered a terrorist by Israeli standards. He wasn't even allowed to be in the Israeli army because people don't realize actually Ben Gvir's Israel has always had a whole spectrum of like hard right ideological ideas, and even the whole idea itself of Israel, this sort of state of the Jews or whatever, is obviously highly problematic. I'm not going to go into it now, but what I do want to point to the fact that Ben Gvir was considered so extreme. Does anyone know why Ben Gvir was made, his tendency was illegal inside Israel for years. Because it has to do with the fact that Ben Gvir believed the ideological track that he followed it assumed, of course, that the Arabs are subhuman and that they're going to also hate us, etc. But they made an ideological equivalence with secular Jews. Between that secular Jews were also an enemy that also could be fought, and that also could be fought violently. Because if secular Jews were successful, it would destroy Judaism. Do you understand? So it's a highly virulent ideological conception, and they were outlawed because they began exercising it. In the early 80s, when there were early Palestinian-Israeli groups trying to stop the closure of Palestinian universities, they started to attack some of the more left-wing Israeli groups, and they said, okay, you're out. That's the only reason they were prevented from entering the Israeli parliament. Things have changed since now, but all that to say, you've got Yale University, basically, some sort of Jewish organization. I understand it's not from the university itself, but from New Haven or whatever, inviting this gentleman here to give a speech as though it's just, I don't know, Good Morning America or something. I don't know what he's doing here. I mean, so it's a dystopian situation almost. It defies logic. Not logic, but we can't be denialist about what allowed us to. We need to be sober and patient and analytical to basically understand this. So, any case, all of this points to the fact that American university responsibility is large in its quantity, it is wide in its scope, it is deep in its qualitative nature, and it is decisive in its impact. Insofar as this is long known, had it not been American support and the weapons that they gave over the last years, we would not be talking about the genocide today here in New Haven. It would be over. By the end of Biden was beginning to restrict. You know what the Israelis were doing in Jabalia at the very end? They were taking old outfitted APCs, loading them up with dynamite, and then driving them robotically into Jabalia and blowing up buildings that way because they had no more 2,000-pound bombs. You see what, and they wanted to hold on to what they had and blah, blah, blah. Trump has unleashed all that, taken away all those restrictions or whatnot. And we're back, not quite at square one, but whatever. We are where we are today. But all that to point to the responsibility. So I'm sure I have no dissidence in that regard here. The next part, though, and it's a responsibility that is direct as well as indirect. And as I said, the most important part about it is that it's determinative, it's decisive for allowing or not allowing what's happening there. And I also do want to say that it's not flat. It's not that, the homeless people who are just outside the door who are trying to use public services here do not have the same responsibilities as a corporate, someone who's decisive in terms of, some board of management or whatnot. We do also have to have some forms of parsing that out. In any case, so that speaks to the question of the responsibilities. The second thing that I wanted to talk about was the dilemmas that we have. Now, both the dilemmas that are ours as a movement, but also that are theirs, the other side, those who are perpetuating this. Because we all have kind of sets of dilemmas in this current situation where we are today. I think the first one to speak to is the one that's most obvious, which is the potential demoralizing one, which is that we're 20 months into this thing, and for as much as we've tried to try and stop this genocide, it hasn't stopped, right? In fact, we've seen it turn to the worst, potentially for the worst, we don't know that it's going there definitively, but we have to be able to act as though it is, because they're being very clear about it, right? Israel has rearmed, Trump has rearmed them with weapons as well as the machinery. And our protests up until now have not been able to stop the genocide, let's say. Maybe we have slowed it down, but it has not stopped it, but there are also factors that are pushing it to accelerate. We have also very clearly seen the undermining of the system itself, all the means and mechanisms that used to exist to sort of prevent this kind of thing in principle. You know, the whole post-war order has actually been undermined. And those who built it actively are undermining it today, which is an important thing to bear in mind, because part of appreciating that is also part of understanding what it will take, I think, to stop this, to understand the historical moment we're in, and to situate ourselves within it. We'll speak about it in a second. But clearly, what is taking place is that there's also sort of a broader dilemma and crisis within U.S. political culture as well as in global trends, right? I mean, it's not by chance that America de facto re-elected a president who was accused of potentially trying to incite a coup or to overturn an election last time, and it resulted in 10 people dying for America to re-elect somebody who actually was willing to go to the extent where things got violent. It says a lot about the kind of political crisis that is taking place. You know it better than me. I'm the guest here. But you are living. You've been here, so I don't need to explain this to you. But in addition to that, you have one other dilemma that I also want to mention here is what relates to the high-tech aspect too. It's the means of I mean, when I talk about Google and Microsoft and Amazon being implicated in what's happening, and then if I were to say, okay, let's all boycott Google and Microsoft, I mean, those things are almost like, state services at this stage, monopolies practically, almost, right? So it's not so simple as just, if there was one building that was the centerpiece of, Zionist American genocide war machinery, we could surround it, we could isolate it, we could put up the information about it. But this is more diffuse, this is broad, this is linked and embedded and entangled in ways of being in America. So we need to sort of appreciate and have a sense of sobriety about that, the largeness of the task, and also what it connotes, I would say, or implies. But certainly all these aspects and these dilemmas, there's this additional element of it where I would say is that there's a broad corrupting dynamic that the genocide is having, not just on world systems of governance, but also on American capitalism and American governance itself, which we are seeing today. Of course, the most recent aspect we saw was how the state now has gotten involved in actually repression of students on university. Now that's not entirely novel. I was with Stanley today, who took me around, who was telling me about how the cops came in. There used to be tanks in New Haven back in the day at some stage. We're not quite having tanks on the street, but we do have federal agents in the state coming in and actually coming on campuses and kidnapping students, violating the academic freedom and integrity of these spaces here, violating basic principles of right to protest, right to organize, and academic freedom itself, all within a broader context of the Trumpist agenda has broad incantations of a strong sort of an Islamophobic agenda, an anti-immigrant agenda, an anti-progressive agenda, and certainly translating the university, trying to attempt to discipline the university so that it is not a space for progressive causes, but whatever, get back to your studies kind of thing, and that's sort of the model, and it's part of Trump and his broader culture wars taking place clearly at the time. So now we could probably parse out these dynamics. What I think is quite interesting is how Trump actually, he decided to go after the university in the first 100 days of his thing, and of his tenure. And I think he really did that basically because neither he nor the Democrats really have any skin in the Palestine movement, right? They both support the genocide. Biden kind of paved the way for Trump to basically continue, right? So, and the Democrats right now are kind of sitting back, rolling over and playing dead, according to James Carville. This is how you deal with a fascist in terms of, a Democratic Party strategy. You don't have to confront them. You don't have to do anything like that. No, they're just going to fall on their own devices, and the lack of, that's basically where we're standing, and that's today. It's quite horrific, of course, but in any case, all these sort of crises are certainly linked. I think we can say they're linked to broader crises of American capitalism today, insofar as it's for America to re-elect Trump. You're talking about everyone declares it and knows it, that we're in a period of Western declinism, we're in a period of a new Cold War, we're in a period where the BRICS organizations, their collective GDP is actually larger than the United States at this stage, lost competition. Let's not forget we had 40 years of unbridled neoliberal unipolar American hegemony, but that basically resulted in massive deindustrialization taking place, capital running to the cheapest, most deregulated places in the world, taking away local jobs and protections at the same time. Capital was free, labor was not free. And then in 2007 and 2008, you had a major economic collapse, right? Had that economic collapse actually fallen on its own devices, right? Had the state not intervened and came in and protected certain parties, we would have been in a dust bowl. I mean, I think that's pretty odd. Everyone said it. It was much larger than what happened in the 30s, right? And in fact, Trump's tariffs today are actually the largest since those that Hoover led in 1930, right? I'm sorry, I'm a political economist. I come from development studies, and so I think it's important to have a little bit of history there. But what's important here, what I would argue is what happened in 2007, 2008 is really important because before that, you had the ideology at the time was neoliberalism, right? It was, we don't need the government for anything. The markets will be self-regulating, okay? Let capital do what it wants to and all boats will rise, okay? And everything will equilibrate, okay? Sorry to sound like the hard Marxist here. But the fact of the matter is when the market went off a cliff and when the housing market was going to go down and then the insurers and then all that business and then the banks were going to go, the government had to come in and it had to print a lot of money and it had to save people. Who was going to be saved and who was not going to be saved is not something that was determined by market forces. It was determined politically. It was determined by power. It was determined by an estimation of those in power of who needs to be protected and who doesn't. Okay, the problem with that, obviously there are many problems, but the problem with that is it's arbitrary. It's what they think. It's their estimation of it. It's not, before it was based on theory, in principle. Neoliberalism is that just let the market play itself out and it will self-correct eventually, okay? That's the hyper-libertarian line of just let markets work, right? But in 2007, when markets didn't work and they were about to collapse the thing, and we recognized that we needed government, it became a supremely political thing, okay? Who gets protected and who doesn't. And a lot of people, and the American population was not mobilized or organized to protect its interests in that way at that time. It came from on top. Now the reason I say that, and I'm sorry for the sort of broad economic thing, is basically because what it meant was for capital to survive and to remain competitive, because capitalism is always something that's relational, okay? It's related to the Europeans, the Chinese, whatever, right? And corporations against each other as well, right? In sectors or whatnot. They want relative profit vis-a-vis their competitors, okay? So what it basically means is I'm losing my train of thought. No, they are seeking where will that profit be? Because if you don't get it, somebody else might get it. So basically, what I'm trying to argue here is Israel pitched itself in the last 20 years, well, 2007, it's not quite 20 years, as a key answer to global Western capitalism, okay? And in fact, if you pull the timeline back to just before October 7th, Biden's big thing was he unveiled this massive new, what did he call it? India, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel, a new trade and hydrocarbon corridor to be able to be the answer to the Chinese ascendance, basically. And Israel was going to be the spigot, was a key centerpiece in the Western puzzle for solving its global capitalist crises, okay? And within that, Israel was able to pitch itself as somebody who could be the guardian of Eastern Mediterranean gas reserves, which were very important because the Europeans were seen as too dependent upon Russian gas. Not just that Israel would provide gas to Europe, but also be the sort of guard dog of the gas in the region. Israel was also a research and development powerhouse for all the military industrial complexes that we know. And certainly, you know, with this laboratorial aspect that I spoke about, that these technologies could also have strong transference to European and American theaters. So within this broader geopolitical strategy. So you had the weapons, you had the hydrocarbons, you had the research and development, and the high tech and the surveillance stuff. So Israel became this part and parcel of the fabric of the way American capitalism foresaw itself. And in this explanation, this analysis, this helps to explain why the very constructors of the post-World War II order were willing to allow a genocide to happen because their own survival depended upon, they saw it as keeping Israel strong and being part and parcel of this broader plan to maintain Western hegemony, basically, and ascendance, okay, unipolarity or whatever. I mean, at least keep the Chinese at bay and other competitors, etc. But we can also acknowledge that it's a floundering, it's a bit of a, you know, whatever approach. In any case, I don't want to lose too much. So these are the various crises, both ours and theirs, I would argue, that we are in. And I would also argue that there is no immediate or magic solution to this analysis that I basically provided. These are broad, large historical factors that are taking place. At the same time, it does not mean that we do not have, that we can't do anything. And I would argue that we can do a lot. And in fact, I would argue, now to transition to the third part of my talk, that there are, in these crises, are also opportunities, and particularly in their crises, in the crises that are out there. Firstly, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that Israel has actually not been successful in what it's attempting to do. Obviously, it killed a lot of people, but it didn't win submission from Hamas or from the Palestinians in Gaza or from the Palestinian people in general. In fact, it invigorated probably the largest, you know, since Vietnam War, popular movement around the world that brought consciousness to the Palestinian cause, which is something that no other movement, you know, neither the First Intifada nor the Second Intifada was able to do. We have Israel is also in the dock being investigated for crimes of genocide. We have Netanyahu, who you know, is considered a war criminal or wanted by the ICJ. Israel, you know, we can also say even Israel's whole model failed. It's not so difficult. I mean, they're killing starving refugees by bombing them from overhead. It's not. It doesn't take a genius. You see what I'm saying? It's not. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. Essentially, that's what's taking place. And Israel's whole sort of tech hasbara that they were so successful with technology, that even failed. Their military strategies, their control strategies, it's all a myth. You know, I mean, it primed a lot of stock market gains, but at the end of the day, it's kind of empty, to be honest. It's also a brave new world. Even according to American recognition, Hamas has been able to replenish its ranks. It's even building more tunnels as we speak. So it's not Israel can hardly claim victory out of this, even though what has happened is horrific. In addition to this, there are other important, serious crises that are taking place besides the ones I mentioned. Israel is in a very serious political crisis. People need to understand the fact that what happened on October 7th destroyed the second major model for how Israel and the West were attempting to manage their Palestine problem. So if we go back to 1967, Israel takes over the occupied territories. There's, today there's 6 million Palestinians underneath the Israeli control. That was a context of direct occupation. Israel was inside Jerusalem, inside Ramallah, inside Nablus, inside Gaza before. But this was not a successful model for the Israelis, because when the first Intifada came up, basically there was an uprising against the Israelis, and the Israelis could not run the cities, the Palestinian cities and places like Gaza. So they opted for indirect occupation, okay? Indirect occupation was these autonomy scenarios of the establishment of the Palestinian Authority and this sort of state-building mythology that was created out of the Oslo process. But with October 7th happening, that too was proven to be a failed model, okay? Because ultimately it led to October 7th, right? So both direct occupation and indirect occupation have failed. And from day one of Israel's assault on Gaza after October 7th, everybody was saying, well, what's the plan for the day after? Firstly, I would argue there is no necessarily day after. But it is a worthwhile question, because are you going to do direct occupation? Israel till today does not know what it wants to do. That's why it's opting either for genocide or for ethnic cleansing, because direct and indirect occupation don't solve it. And let's not forget that there's also a major demographic issue going on here, because we've already tipped the scales where basically you do not have a Jewish demographic majority between the river and the sea. And that's Israel is also thinking in those terms. So Israel has a political crisis of management. It has a military crisis in terms of, it has not been able to defeat Hamas. It is also a military crisis in terms of whether there's a serious question whether Israel will be able to actually field an army, even though it has sent out sort of it's making another call-up of reserves, but there's serious questions whether actually... Ben Gurion always used to say Israel should not wait. Israel's wars needs to be fast and strong. I mean, and that was the best way to sort of scare people or whatnot and not let people mess with Israel. But this is a long, grinding war, and many Israelis are also asking the questions, to what effect and why? And that is not going to go away, especially when Netanyahu's coalition is made up of people who say, no, my whole goal is I'm going to just be working on the Torah here. You guys can go fight for me, So that's another major issue. In addition, of course, we have Israel's international crisis. It's pariahhood internationally. It's pretty obvious. You have South Africa raising that question, which is a very important one. And then you also have a very important social crisis happening in Israel that existed previous to October 7th. If you remember, the largest demonstrations in Israeli history were actually taking place just before October 7th, having to do with Netanyahu's attempt to change the rules of the game inside Israel. To roughly put it, basically, it was the old Ashkenazi elite that set up Israel, and there was elements of a kind of cultural hegemony that they sort of, because basically the whole project of Israel, of trying to bring Jews from around the world, was a very complicated thing that needed forms of intra-Jewish mediation. So they agreed upon Jewish democracy. The democratic aspect of Israel was a function of needing to mediate intra-Jewish disputes while tolerating a Palestinian minority. It couldn't be significant, right? They couldn't threaten the majority in terms of the state, but intra-Jewish problems need to be mediated through democratic means. And that was the initial Israeli state project that they established, right? Netanyahu did something where after 30 years of globalizing Israel, and a lot of the Ashkenazi elites sort of got other passports and they did well out of Oslo and the Israeli capital went global, Netanyahu allied the periphery of the second Israel. The second Israel was the there used to be something called Beautiful Israel, which was how the Israelis called the sort of Ashkenazi project of sort of reinventing the European Jewry, basically. Netanyahu brought together the hard ideological right, the Arab Jews, the Orthodox Jews, and together with the Likud, and he created a stable political bloc that was larger than the Ashkenazis in the end. And they wanted to change the entire rule of the game, which was a move again. Basically, Netanyahu accuses, Netanyahu said he wanted to make the attorney general be appointed politically, and also that judges would not appoint themselves, but that they would be also appointed politically. Netanyahu said, the old system was actually protecting Ashkenazi cultural elitism. There was a basis to that. The Ashkenazis accused Netanyahu of saying, well, you're basically going to introduce, the Torah into our judicial system, and political appointment is a very dangerous thing when it comes to democracy. So those crises are not going to go away. In fact, they are severely dividing Israel. And a key part of this, I'm sorry just to sort of go too much into detail about it, is the key dynamic aspect of Israeli society economically, in addition to the money that's coming in from the Americans, is basically the high-tech sector, right? America and the West has sort of pumped in all this research and development money into Israel to develop all these technologies and stuff. That's coming out of Tel Aviv, okay? And Israeli's stock market and stuff is all built around that stuff, right? The key point here, though, is high tech needs a judiciary that doesn't have the Torah in it. You see what I'm saying? If Amazon is going to have a fight with Google over who knows what, they don't need what the rabbi has to say to be able to mediate that dispute. And if the rabbi is in that dispute, they can go somewhere else. They will go somewhere else, or they'd probably bring, and so that's the major thing that's going on in Israel. You have the threat of serious out-migration, and they already say in the first year and a half of this October thing that 700,000 Israelis have left Israel, and it's not just a numerical departure, it's a qualitative one, okay? So these are large, long-term, structural aspects, factors that are at play, okay? And which we also need to bear in mind in what's going on, and we see as important. You have ex-Israeli prime ministers talking about Israel on the brink of civil war. You have Israeli intellectual class, like Tom Segev, and even Avi Shleim, and who now, after all of this, are basically saying, maybe this Zionism thing wasn't right. It's a very key, important thing to say, because for years these guys were the folks who provided a form of liberal legitimacy to the project that integrated this Zionist project into Western liberalism. It never was. It was kind of always a bastard child of thing, because in the end there always was deep debates within Jewish thought, Jewish European thought, about how to solve the anti-Semitism question, whether the answer to that was kind of a socialist, equal rights solution, or it was to create a state of, Jewish self-determination. And the Jewish self-determination line was the minority line, but it won because the Holocaust happened, because the West supported the revisionist, the reactionary Zionist project. The British saw to it that they could use this political impetus in their colonial designs, basically. And today we see the results. You have people like Avi Shlaim, the Israeli historian, saying, you fed a monster, and this is what you have. You see the Israeli project. So that's where we are today. To try and wrap it up, when we hear things like Trump speaking about the Riviera and Gaza, these all speak to a kind of fantastical, reaching for straws, as though there's a magical solution to this thing. I came up with this idea. He didn't even tell Netanyahu he was going to do it. You could tell from his face. He said, we're going to just create the Riviera. And even think about it though for a second. America actually inherited the Israeli project. It was from the British. It wasn't their project, right? It was something that came out of the whole European thing. But in principle, Israel was supported, so it could be a kind of Western ally in this region, right? Out of the blue, Trump says, Gaza, that's going to be an American thing. How did you give up that great piece of real estate, Netanyahu? That's crazy of you, or whatever. But think about it. I mean, the fact that Trump thinks that, in a magical thinking world, that actually we need to reinvent a new kind of colonialism where we are active parties, because even the Israelis aren't good enough. They're not serving it's a de facto disappointment with the Israeli. You understand what I'm saying? You're creating a competing colonial power. And by the way, the Israelis weren't, even though they're willing to accept the Americans talking about the Riviera and all that business, because they understand that a prerequisite for it is ethnic cleansing, de facto they're not happy about it, because that's Eretz Israel for their point. And we're here, we don't need the Americans in this neighborhood, So it's all speaks to major political and strategic crises that are taking place. And because of that, I would argue that we, as a Palestine movement, with the intention to try and stop this genocide, need to embed ourselves in both long and short-term projects that attempt to capitalize on the contradictions and the weaknesses of this strategy in a longer-term vision that kind of bets, so to speak, that look, we don't know whether we're going to win, but the destruction of Palestine is also the destruction of a kind of liberalism, a kind of humanism, a kind of morality, something much larger. And we're not alone in that. You see what I mean? There are many players who have that interest in that game. We are maybe on the front lines of it today. But we need to build a movement that attempts to try and collect those passions and those interests and those right bearers, those who hold those rights, in a long-term project, while at the same time not losing sight of those who perpetuate the genocide directly, and not to let them off the hook. And in that regard, I would also be very, clearly the structures of preventing a genocide have failed. We need to create that force. We need to see ourselves as creating a force capable of stopping the genocide through our own will. And insofar as we can potentially attempt through the existing institutions that we have to prevent the genocide to do that, but they've also already failed, we also need to build parallel with them. So we need to be one foot in the system, pushing the contradictions of that, and trying to develop and expand the progressive interpretation of politics and law and institutions that stops that kind of activity. But we also need to have an extra parliamentary, on the street, direct action mode of organizing that also calls things out because, and attempts to physically stop. And ideally, I would argue that we need to go ahead and not just of direct action of an individual here or there, or taking out a corporation, or I don't know exactly what, but ideally we want to do it through our labor force, I would argue. And the end of the day of South Africa, the South African apartheid regime was brought down first through the struggle of the South African people and their leadership, etc. But a big part of it was the Western periphery and the corollary, where dock workers in Liverpool or in Los Angeles, organized unions said, we're not going to touch apartheid labor. And the fundamental apartheid militarism, or any products that are going to go to South Africa. And that's the best way to actually, that's where we need to be heading toward. But to do that, you need to have an organized labor force. You need to have people to be, mentally prepared and willing and with the experience to be able to do that. So there is no cookie cutter approach. The one other thing that I do want to say, though, is one important aspect, I would argue, is what I want to call power mapping, okay, which is an important part, which enables us to go from these broad generalities and political analysis into a more case-specific situation. Take a situation like Yale, okay? Yale is, this big billion-dollar university, whatever, but the fingerprints of genocide may be here. We don't know. Maybe it's in the trustees, maybe it's in their portfolios, maybe it's in the research that's being done here. We don't know exactly. The students have asked some of those questions, but they've been shut down, whatever. When I talk about power mapping, I'm talking about in every locality, New Haven, in corporations, in universities, in cities, in towns, cities, states, countries, we need to find the guilty parties. Where is the deepest facilitation of genocide logic and implications going on? Who are these people? What are they invested in? Who are the worst abusers of this situation? And then can we, I believe, and we have to believe, that we can organize and mobilize, that there must be amongst this the low-hanging fruit. You see what I'm saying? We need to sort of bring the large body of well-meaning people in this room and outside the room. Before I came here, everyone in this room, sorry, nothing to say, I don't want to make too much of a judgment, but it looks like we're all over 35, 40 maybe, I don't want to say. But before we came here, there was some hunger-striking kids, like on the library of, I don't know, wherever, somewhere in Yale here or whatever. And they were below 30, that's for sure, right? There's generational differences here, there's ethnic differences, there's consciousness differences, whatever. But I think the Palestine movement has shown that there is wide sympathy, and we have broken new grounds, and there is a potential. So if we need to map the power, map the biggest abusers, name and shame, and call out and run wide coalitions as big as we can to try and sort of go for the lowest hanging fruit first, if that makes sense, in a broad sense of strategy, I would argue, okay? And that's the best I can say for every, otherwise, and that will look different in different places because different places are connected to Israel in different ways, right? But the principle remains. So I think that's where we stand today. It's the best I can say for opening up a conversation. And I don't know, I'm very interested to also hear where you guys are at and your feelings and your thoughts after 18, 20 months of where we are and how we can move forward. So thank you.
Directly talking to Hamas, pulling from bombing Yemen, and all these things are directly affects Netanyahu. And I'm just like, I know Trump has his own interests in that, not the Palestinian people interest, of course. But it's just, I don't know how far this is is it taking us in a good place or in a worse place? So if you talk about this a little bit.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I've been in New York, so I haven't been following 100% everything, but I did hear both aspects of it. I think we do. I mean, I gave the quotation from the beginning of this Joseph Borrell's fellow. Like, it's clear that, I mean, obvious that the elite themselves have been divided. And Trump himself, I think that's quite important to acknowledge, his own administration, it's more about pandering to him and loyalty than it has any form of ideological or political coherence as a project. From my academic perspective, I think that's pretty clear. It's a coalition of crackpots and kooks and racists and who knows what. Anti-Semites, exactly, yeah. But there's a degree of transparency to it, And okay, I mean, they're using Signal for, it's all nonsense, right? I mean, it's not serious. But it's very serious at the same time, right? So it's not. We shouldn't be surprised by intra-elite, the fact that the continued resistance and the of the Palestinian people, and that they have not been successful, leads to reverberating crises within the elites themselves. Okay, and we should pocket those, but we shouldn't rely upon them. That's what I would say. We pocket them because, at the end of the day, Trump is like, okay, whatever, I'm not going to break my neck, for every, he's an anti-Semite himself. It's ridiculous. He doesn't care. He'll throw them under the bus like tomorrow. We know they're going, if his whole project goes down, he's going to start blaming who knows who, He's blaming students in Colombia for being anti-Semitic, but he's letting out people with SS on their T-shirts from the January 6th thing. And that's why, it's so dangerous what he's doing. Everything has been turned into, anti-Semitism, this weaponization of it. It trivializes things, and the truth is, there's a very serious. There is the potential for a serious anti-Semitic, thing in this country, and it's coming from the top, let alone from the bottom and from the bottom. Especially look, we're in a settler colonial society in America. Okay, I don't want to be too hardcore Marxist on folks, but I do also want to say, on the ascent in this country, you had 200, 300 years of we've had post-World War II American, the best time in world history, probably, right? On the other hand, we're in a period of declinism now. And when the American dream is sort of becomes obvious that it's sort of there's a retreat around it, those who control are going to hold on to it, and then there's going to be this. There already is a sort of a vicious intra group sort of fighting going. Whatever. It's not a fighting. I'm not trying to advocate for some sort of that there's some kind of civil war that's about to happen, but the American project is in crisis unless something, and they're doing a divide and rule going on here, basically. In any case, I think Trump is doing his maneuverings in his sort of typical narcissist sense. He has, at some time, his nativist and his isolationist politics, where he wants to pull out. There's strong contradiction. What I'm saying is that when there's no political integrity to his project, American dominance largely relied upon its large empire. But at the same time, he wants to pull America out, and he wants to make the Europeans pay for it. And he's like, why should I be paying for, bombing the Yemenis or whatnot? Let the Europeans do it. They're the ones who are actually getting the stuff from Yemen and whatnot. He's an attempted correction to the problems that are at stake, and we will be able to benefit from it. But we have to stop the politics of looking up, I would argue, and we need to embed the politics of what we can do and how we can impose from down up. You see what I mean? Because this representational democracy business, which American liberal democracy has already shown itself to fail on the genocide question, and and that's a pretty serious thing to say, but it is. I support democracy, obviously, but I don't think, but it's a superficial democracy if it's not broadened, so to speak. I mean, these are large political questions. I'm not going to, and economic questions, I'm not going to go into all these aspects, but in any case, yeah, I don't know. The truth is, we need to build it from below upwards, basically, and in a way to impose it, because ultimately that's what, because actually if you take, I think, statistically, Americans don't have it within their, they don't support the genocide in Gaza. They don't have an interest in supporting apartheid. I mean, I went to the bathroom here. The stench in there from the poor homeless people who are, it's horrific. There's no social protection here. Israel is an advanced industrial state. It has a well-developed health sector. I mean, why are they getting $4 billion a year? But that's only possible because of the weakness of social and political organizing in this country. To be able to create that. I support everybody getting health care everywhere. I'm not trying to take it away from some and give it to another. It's not that way. But it's part of a larger redistributive project, both material as well as rights-based. And the Palestine movement is sort of forcing and exposing all the weaknesses of that system. And now it's being clear that the success of the Palestine movement is also linked to the success or not of a lot of progressive agendas in this country and what this country will be about. And it's not necessarily true and the case that there will be a linear, straightforward, that we're always going to be making more money or being more progressive or whatnot. Democracies can go backwards too. And that's what we're seeing right now. And the thing that can, it's not because we're not wealthy. You see, there's still, the money is here. You see what I'm saying? It has to do with redistribution and who controls the wealth and under what conditions, etc. And so that correction needs to take place. But it takes time, it takes energy, it takes focus, it takes, and we can't, so, yeah.
Yeah, but that was one thing that I thought was failing in your analysis, that go after a place like Yale, because for other reasons, we've always gone after a place like Yale, and they seem to always end up doing better than we do. In other words, they provide jobs,
right.
So people will go along with them because they have the jobs, they have the money,
Right.
So that they can influence the politics. What can you do against that kind of a...
I mean, that's the question. That's why I'm saying the real thing that you can do, you can name them and shame them. You can expose their trustees. You can expose their portfolios. You can shut down certain things. That doesn't mean you even win. You don't necessarily win immediately. You see, we want it. We need victory now, because any loss of blood in unjust circumstances is already a crime, and it's happening. But we're part of historical processes. It's true. We need to build a movement that can defend and protect and prevent these kinds of abuses, but it doesn't happen overnight. So, and it doesn't mean that they always win, though. They don't always win. They don't. They have wealth, and I mean, look, it's Yale. The solution to Yale is not going to be solved in and of itself within Yale. No. You see, it's part of larger things. The state could come in and say, "Look, we're going to privatize this damn thing. Give us your damn endowment." Why do you have $60 billion for an endowment that was given to you? That most of that money probably came from colonialism and slavery and who knows what, right? Right? I mean,
yeah.
I'm sorry. I know. I have people in my family. I know what this institution is about. Like, it's not particular Yale in and of itself. It's a larger phenomena. There's contradictions in this. It's not just one big evil thing or empire or whatnot. You see,
it has happened. During, say, the Panther trials and during Vietnam War, that they have exposed. I mean, even a lot of the alumni have come and said, how horrible Yale is, but Yeah.
I just, no, I really forgot, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just that I agree, I think the shaming, I don't know, maybe because I'm, Catholic upbringing of the guilt and the shame, and you just shame them, and I kind of agree with that, but in a sense also, but like Harvard now is coming to say, I graduated from Columbia, and I'm embarrassed. I'm so embarrassed that they caved for $400 million when they have endowment of billions and billions. And I was happy when Harvard stood up.
Yeah.
But how much are they standing up? Do you know what I mean?
Good.
Like how much are they standing up? I mean, yeah, it looks nice they're standing up, but are they really standing up? I mean, I
So
would get down to
it's a really important question, these things I would argue. Like, look, firstly, academic freedom comes out of basically in the study of theology was underneath, states and state religions. There was at a certain point the need for people who were studying theology to be independent from the state, which was trying to impose one theological line, right? So eventually, slowly but surely, you develop institutions that are about study, that are independent study, and that is an important part of a project. It can't just be state line the whole time, right? You need free thinking. That's part of bourgeois liberal democracy post-Enlightenment. Sorry, right? Okay, that's what universities are about. Now, but at the end of the day, universities are also big, bad institutions with a lot of money from who knows where. That the research that's done here is worth billions, trillions.
Yeah.
It's worth trillions. The other guy the other day, he took the phone and he says, this has 5,000 patents in it. Each one of the patents worth $1 billion or whatever, right? Like, it's money. You can make a lot of money off of research. That's what research is about, right? Okay? They obviously want, as an institution, they want the technology and the research that goes on here for, ultimately, it's for conservative purposes, for money-making purposes, for what? They don't want it for expanding human, you see what I'm saying? Like, knowledge can go both ways. It can go towards using technology to develop remote weaponry and drones or whatever, but you could also develop, who knows, other technologies that could solve human problems, right? So it's about the character of how technology and how research is used and towards what end. I would argue. Now the universities and the trustees, I would argue all of them are conservative. To some extent there's a split. On one sense, like Harvard or whatever is scared, that's pretty, the Financial Times, you don't need to be Harvard, the Financial Times came out and said, look, it's a really dangerous thing if governments are getting involved in universities because that's North Korea. That's
You already are.
Well, there's a different, they need to sort of respect the kind of autonomy of intellectuals and academic practice just for self-corrective purposes of the thing. But if the state comes in and says, no, your Middle East Studies department can't be teaching this and has to be doing that, that's North Korea. That's autocracy. That's not academic freedom. Okay, so from their own liberal values, some of them are standing up for it. But at the same time, there's tensions within the thing. They want, So what I saw happen at Columbia was basically the trustees wanted the students. They recognized that they lost. They rolled over because they wanted. The state could do it, but they couldn't. You understand?
They fired the lawyer, the law professor, after 20
Correct.
years.
Correct.
Because of her.
Correct. Yeah.
And I'm so happy to see her on Instagram.
Correct.
Giving, hints saying Columbia, they set that up. They didn't set it up. She didn't say that. She was very careful. She was a lawyer. But they knew that this was going to happen, and they have a graduation coming up.
Right.
So they baited. They didn't bait because she wouldn't have said that. But basically, when Butler Library was stormed, they were ready, and they were hoping that the loudest students and the loudest people would be taken out before graduation.
Right.
So they didn't have to cancel
Right.
the graduation like they did last year.
Right.
And they didn't cancel. They canceled the big graduation. They didn't cancel. Columbia has its own graduation, the college itself. The kids graduate. Everyone's like, oh, they lost their. No, it was a big one that is, you know,
The university-wide.
the university-wide, where you have the law school, the,
Yeah.
you know, med school, that, you know, that's what was canceled. But the individual one where the parents can go and see their kid get the, I mean, that wasn't canceled. I mean, so, you know, but the media, but anyway, they like that big, beautiful, you know, on the steps and whatnot, and so they said, she actually came out and said, just be careful, recognize before you do something what you might be getting into. Like, just know the second, you know, like chess.
Yeah.
Know what the next move is going to be on the other side before you do something,
sure.
which I thought was really nice. I mean, that was kind of her to offer after she wasn't fired. She was forced to resign.
To be honest, I see the next stage of the whole movement right now, and particularly in America, is that we need to kind of like, we've had mass movements and whatnot, but we need to basically, I think we need to do something like a kind of pledge where you gather the forces who are, like, based upon the basic concept that average Americans have no interest in apartheid or genocide, that your institutions, our institutions, need to be apartheid, genocide free. So we, the people, pledge to make our institutions and our communities apartheid and genocide free, okay? And that starts a dynamic where you establish a moral, political line, and then from that you expose, well, are you or are you not? Like, I mean, that sets the framework. And then so is this place or is this not apartheid or genocide free? Do you have links with Israeli universities? Because Israeli there's good research on this now that shows the implication of Israeli universities in these projects. What are our science people doing? What are all these aspects of, and universities are actually quite key because within university is one of the only institutions in liberal bourgeois society that actually have a mandate to be free thinking and they, you know, internally critical. If you go to a corporation, that's not the mandate of a corporation is to make money, right? Churches and religious places or whatnot, you know, I mean, in principle, I think they, you know, obviously an interpretation of whatever church practice potentially or religious practice could be a form of social justice, but it's not always. Ideally, yes, I think those are potential good allies, but what I'm saying is the university itself as an institution has within its DNA, it has to accept academic freedom. It has to have open debate in principle. And because of that, the political questions of the day you can force the contradiction through it. That's why they're trying to choke it here. And it's very important for them to choke it, especially in this early phase of Trump's thing, because if the universities remain a space where potential this sort of, you know, it can get you go back to all the 60s and stuff. All right, so plenty of questions. Looks like all of a sudden.
Yeah, I think it's back to you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us all. I'm going to shift the conversation for a moment. I'm wondering, what is the role of Hamas and the role of the Palestinian Authority to bring this to an end? What is their role? And we have seen our brothers and sisters, Palestinian brothers and sisters in Gaza, even coming out to protest against, you know, Hamas. So that is a question I have for you. I know what I try to do here to put an end to this war, but I'm wondering what is their role?
Thank you for the question. What we're talking about with those two is Palestinian political representation and leadership. Firstly, the broad context in which Palestinians exist is not one on the ground. Is not one of clearly, you know, open, free, organizing society. So no one has the inability to freely organize makes it difficult and impossible for actually have a full democratic representational structure. So that's an important thing to acknowledge, which basically means that political organizing needs to take place underground, okay? So interestingly enough, you talked about Hamas on one side and the Palestinian Authority on the other. I would argue that's a false dichotomy, like, because it's actually Hamas and Fatah, And then the Palestinian Authority is the body that was created by the international community and the Israelis that is animated by Fatah, okay? And when they prevented Hamas from taking over the institutions of the Palestinian Authority, when they won the elections decisively in 2006, it meant that that body was basically supposed to be just a body that would either permanently have Fatah in it, or at least was designed to have a set of politics that were only going to be submissive to sort of Israeli international diktats, so to speak. Okay. Those are kind of important things to say. So what we have in terms of Palestinian political representation, in terms of Hamas and Fatah, are different political ideologies that, are attempting to achieve Palestinian national rights in the ways that they declare. I would argue in the last period, and it's pretty obvious, that Hamas is the ascendant project that has entered to fill the national political space created both by the fact that they've been under occupation and the need for self-determination, etc., but also because the Oslo project and Fatah's project and the two-state solution also failed, okay, and was failed by the international community. They did not stand up look, you have to see that part of the story in a larger historical lens, where basically Palestinians felt themselves entitled to all of historical Palestine. The PLO took a political trajectory in 1974 to say, look, we're going to accept two states. We're going to go down the international pathway because the international, the Arabs and the Third World movement said, go down the international pathway. Don't scare the Israelis into whatever, throwing the Jews into the sea or all that business or whatever. You can get all your rights by going through the international path. And they did it. They went through the international path, and they ended up with apartheid, and then they ended up with genocide, right? And by the way, it's very telling to say that Netanyahu, even if they destroy Hamas or whatever, they don't want the Palestinian Authority. They don't want Fatah. So it's not about one or the other. It's about Israeli rejectionism of Palestinian national rights, and basically Zionism's inability to tolerate another national group in that area, okay? And seeing it in existential terms for them. So obviously there are grave, and I have personal differences with these political strategies of these existing Palestinian leaderships, but I'm not going to, I believe that's an internal Palestinian political debate to have. I'm happy to discuss those matters. They're both deficient in my terms, but I also think they also don't need to be over, I don't know how to say it. I think the general trajectory of Hamas in the last year, there's some interesting political things happening. I don't know if you guys have seen what they're doing. Hamas actually is petitioning the British government to actually get rid of its terrorist thing, whatever its classification or whatnot. And there's a basis to that. Won national elections. It's actually has not. Well, anyway, I'm not going to go. It's not my position, and I'm not interested in defending them or not, or talking about their taxes and strategy. They speak for themselves, and they live and die according to their sword. But I don't. In general, I would still say though that they are without question in Gaza. And I'm sorry to say this. Not sorry to say this, but I'm saying this. I believe they are not just resilient through force of arms in Gaza. No, as though they're oppressing other Palestinians. No, I think from all my feeling and my reading of the situation on the ground, there's a broad majority of people who are willing to go with them as a project in this day and era, because they don't see a division. Of course, not everyone is Hamas, and I'm sorry because it's important to say that, because also the Israelis want to say no one is innocent in Gaza and all these sort of things, but at the same time, they are. Hamas developed in Gaza. It came out of those camps. All the Hamas leadership has been. A lot of the things that they're trying to wipe out, what the Israelis were doing, these bombing campaigns, were taking out the entire families of anyone who had one person from Hamas. It's going to take out 125 people, who are all around you, and people tend to live together because that's how it works. So, it's. I'm not really sure what to say. I don't think people should bank on or play. It's not our role. I would argue. I have my differences with them, but at the end of the day, I think the problem the light needs to be posed on the Israelis and the Americans and the facilitation, etc., rather than, and not to have any hopes or whatever. It's not. We are not at a stage where Hamas is any kind of external party that is imposing itself on the situation. On the contrary, Hamas would win elections in Palestinian society today, I'm quite sure, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, and by the way, across the Middle East. And I'm not kidding there, because you have a political crisis going on, not just in Palestine and across the region, and it's been dictatorships and whatever, and the impetus to move towards, look, the Islamists nationalized and they work to, I don't know. We don't have time to go into the whole post-World War II, post-colonial Arab state and its failures, basically, but. It didn't come out of nowhere. That's not to absolve it from responsibilities, but we just need to know where it's coming from. And it's not distinct, to be honest. And it's not unique, and the West is also not unique. It's not that the Americans are so secular or whatnot. You see what I'm saying? Why all of a sudden why is Islamic politics considered so controversial? Martin Luther King was a reverend. It's not that it's natural that there would be in a place where institutions were wiped out, and there's no representative institutions, that the Islamic, that religious institutions would play that role, and it's a form of social responsibility. You don't have a state; it's an occupation, So it's not. In any case, yeah.
We have 3 more questions.
Yeah.
For the sake of time, let's dig them.
I know that Phil has a question.
So do I.
Yes.
Well, but before, almost equally important though, is that we talk about things that are happening. The various groups have projects. I know the medical, opponents. So if we're going to get kicked out pretty soon, so let's, maybe shorter on the questions.
Sorry, what time are we getting kicked out?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Okay. Go ahead.
So my question is about hope and a new development. We've been saying all along that unless we can change American public opinion, and that public opinion can change our government, which we're still, there's clearly a majority of Americans that are against what Israel's doing in Gaza. You'd never know that to see what happens in Congress. In chapter 4 of Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, which deals with the invasion of Lebanon and the massacre of Salman Shatila. Immediately after that, there was a massive protest against that massacre. And the protest was 400,000.
Where?
400,000 Israelis
Yes.
in Tel Aviv in the street protesting the massacre that Israel facilitated and planned. That would not happen today.
Correct.
Except in the last week, there are Israelis now in Tel Aviv marching in the street with pictures of dead Palestinian children. And when they started that, they were attacked by the police. But there has been a change in the police policy, and yesterday there were 200 or 300 or 400 Israelis marching in Tel Aviv against the massacre, against the genocide in Gaza. I don't know if that's reason to hope or not, but it seems like maybe it is.
I have difficulty believing that Israeli society, like the 400,000. Look, there was a serious debates in Israel about how best to preserve the Israeli project after 67. Some people were like, some people said no, like, look, 67 allows us to legitimize 48, what we took in 48, and actually we should get out of OPT, West Bank, Gaza, and it's only going to be a nightmare. And some Israelis said, look, very quickly, we need to be careful about this because but the truth of the matter is, and it was started from the Labor Party itself. They started the settlement project. They started the integration of the water and the mountains and the settlement project, and they made it indivisible, you know, in a slow process of attempting to basically integrate and unite the conquests of 48 and 67. And that resulted in the situation that we are in today. But in 82, that was, remember, 82 is 15 years, I guess, after 67, right? And that's also Begin. And, you know, that's the beginning of the ascent of the second Israel at the expense of the beautiful Israel. So those culture wars are still going on there, okay? And so that partially, both that ideological political divide and that cultural divide, I would say, is probably the groundswell of the basis of the 400,000 and those early demonstrations. Fast forward, whatever that is now, I don't know, 40, 50 years or whatever we are now, I don't know, like, this is the tragedy of what happened. Like that today, now you have Tom Segev and the Avi Shlaim saying, okay, maybe the Zionism thing was a problem. But we had 30, 40 years of Israelis thinking that that there was no question about the nature of Israel. That, you know, that the Zionism thing had already won. It's over. And now the question is where we draw the border, right? And that's a problem because, you know, so when you talk about 200, 300, 400 people, that's pretty minimal. A good part of them might be Palestinians inside Israel, by the way.
There have been massive demonstrations against the judicial reform.
No question.
Months.
Yes.
And when pro-Palestinian activists attempted to integrate with those protests, they were thrown out.
Exactly.
But now these protests are clearly against what's happening in Gaza.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be, there always will be a harder core element of folks who are going to be against the thing, but on a popular level, it's part of Israeli organized political culture. It's not a part of it. The supposed opposition today is not it's a cultural opposition. It's not a real serious political opposition. They oppose Netanyahu for many different internal reasons, but standing up for the Palestinians, unfortunately, is not one of them at this stage. We have not seen that dynamic. You're more likely to see out-migration of that population than them standing up for the Palestinians and calling for equal rights. That's where we are.
Can you take Paula's last
Back to what you raised before about shaming institutions. I want to bring it to another level. The institution that I feel needs most to be shamed is the United Nations. And it will talk a good talk, whatever, and pass resolutions, and nothing is happening. What's going on is against the UN Charter, it's against international law, it's against the Geneva Conventions, it's against Nuremberg. How can this still be going on when there are supposedly all these rules of conduct of the book that are agreed to by so many countries? So what is it that could be pushing the envelope? I mean, I almost think it would be a good thing. A very good thing if the U.S. were kicked out of the United Nations.
Look, I think we need to be very careful, though, here. I'm with you. Look, but what was the predecessor to the United Nations? The League of Nations. League of Nations was some sort of European coalition where they ended up dividing the world amongst themselves, and you know, most of the world population was not part and parcel of it. And by the way, the UN itself obviously is implicated in the partition of Palestine. And what happened? There's only 45 countries which are voting on it, and most of them are colonial countries themselves, and blah blah blah, etc. The point is not that it's an ideal situation. Anyone can come up with a utopian model of whatever. The truth is, on the ground, power on the ground, you know, how realizable, how can you how can you make it real? You see what I'm saying? And that requires organized power on the ground with